It is my pleasure to welcome you to our February 3rd Thursday lecture here at Mandarin Museum. My name is Brittany. I'm the director here. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Vincent Adejumo, correct?
Yes.
Did you say his name again?
Dr. Vincent Adejumo.
Yes.
Adejumo.
Adejumo, yes.
And he is here, guest lecturer at University of Florida.
No, my last semester teaching at University of Florida was 2025.
Oh.
So I am completely free and independent of any
Constraints.
Yeah, exactly. So the good thing is that I'm myself and my wife, we own a construction company and an ABA therapy center for kids with autism.
I used to work in an ABA center.
Well,
I was the office manager.
Well, we have to converse.
Yeah.
But you know, still with my experience teaching at University of Florida, teaching K through 12, you know. But now I'm at the point now where we're doing this full time, and also running our businesses. So.
Awesome. Well, you have done tremendous research and presentations on the Black Seminoles of Florida.
Yes.
And also their impact during the Seminole Wars.
Yes.
Which is of great interest to us, because I know typically you think of the Seminole Wars further south, but there were skirmishes happening in this area. So we are very interested. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And I know it seems silly to use a microphone, but it does make a big difference.
All right,
so
perfect.
there you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we go ahead and get started.
Oklahoma from belated government payouts for lands taken hundreds of years ago. But what makes the Seminoles unique is the fact that this tribe, unlike any other, has existed for nearly 3 centuries as a mixture of Indians and blacks, runaway slaves who joined the Indians as warriors in Florida. Together, they fought government troops in some of the bloodiest wars in U.S. history. In the late 1830s, the Seminoles lost their land and were forced to a new Indian home in what is now Oklahoma. Over the years, some of them intermarried, and that blurred the color lines even further. Now, the government is paying the tribe $56 million for those lost Florida lands, and the money is threatening to divide a nation. Talk to Seminole Chief Jerry Haney. He says the black members are no longer welcome by many in the tribe. After 300 years together, the chief says the tribe wants them to either prove they're Indian or get out. What are you hoping that the black Seminoles will do now? Are you hoping they will just pack up and go away?
I would hope so.
So if they're black and they can't prove that they have Indian blood, go away.
Basically. That's what we're saying.
Harsh words from the Seminole chief for the 2,000 black members of this mixed Indian tribe. In response, they say they're just as much Seminole as he is.
I fished in these woods, I hunted in these woods, I went to stone dances just like the regular Seminoles did. And I never knew I was any different for a long time.
On any given Sunday, go with Loretta Guest to the Indian Baptist Church in Seminole County, Oklahoma, and you'll find red and black Seminoles praying together, singing hymns in Seminole, sharing meals and catching up on tribal news. Walk with her through the Indian cemetery out back, and you'll find their ancestors are buried together as well.
My aunt was next to him.
Were there any distinctions made as to, you all are the black Seminoles, we're nice to you, but you're the black Seminoles?
No, nothing like that. We've always been treated as one to another. No difference at all.
It was an alliance that began more than 300 years ago in Florida when runaway slaves and different Indian tribes sought refuge together and later fought the white man. Joe Opala, a history professor at James Madison University in Virginia, says that from the beginning it was a melting pot tribe. So these people all banded together and somehow became Seminole?
In fact, the word Seminole is not even an Indian word. It is derived from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning runaway slave. And so from the beginning, you don't have an Indian tribe. It was a multi-ethnic coalition.
Historical evidence documents their close relationship. Blacks became chiefs, signed treaties, and served on the tribal council. They intermarried. They were equals, Opala says, and the Indians depended on them as warriors and interpreters. So there absolutely is proof of the Black Seminole importance to the tribe.
Absolutely. There's a lot of intelligence information that passes back to Washington. For instance, General Jessup, the commanding general, writes back at one point to the War Department and says, the Negroes ruled the Indians. What he was referring to was the fact that no significant decision was ever taken in the Seminole councils unless the black members agreed to it.
When the Red and Black Seminoles were forced out of Florida in the 1830s, they traveled together hundreds and hundreds of miles by boat and on foot, passing through this barren place on the banks of the Arkansas River all the way to Oklahoma. It was a long and difficult journey, referred to as their Trail of Tears for the many who died along the way. Now, nearly 200 years later, comes the $56 million payment from the federal government to compensate the tribe for those lost Florida lands. But the Black Seminoles can't share in it because the government and the tribe say they were slaves of the Red Seminoles back then, and as slaves could not have owned land. Joe Opala, who has worked to preserve their legacy, says that's wrong.
Black Seminoles fought side by side, died, bled for those lands in Florida. They've been together, they've been good brothers and good neighbors for 3 centuries. It makes no sense now to say they're not Indians.
Our ancestors were some of the most fiercest fighters during the war.
During the Indian Wars.
Yes, due to the fact that they knew if they were recaptured, they were going into slavery, back into slavery.
Bud Crockett and his sister Polly Gentry traced their Seminole roots back to their great-grandmother Dora Davis, who came to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. But family legend and physical resemblance aren't enough. Today, you have to be able to prove your Indian heritage, which is hard for most Black Seminoles because of something called the Dawes Rolls, a government census of sorts created in the late 1800s, which separated the tribe into the Blood or Red Seminoles and the Freedmen or Black Seminoles. Intermarriage made no difference, as Polly and Bud discovered with their ancestors.
If you had any black blood in you whatsoever, you were a freedman.
So it didn't matter how much Indian blood you had. Just
Right.
any black blood,
Right.
you went on a separate roll.
Right?
And on the Black Seminole roll, it doesn't list that you have any Indian blood.
That is correct.
Did you feel equal to the Black Seminoles?
Sure, at one time, yes. Still do. Still do. But when money and the government entered into the picture, everything changed. Everything changed.
If they don't have any Indian blood or prove it, then they're not looked at as Indians.
Putting aside that history of togetherness, the Blood Seminoles are going by the book, that is, the government's book. They're relying on that 100-year-old census which separated the Black Seminoles from the rest of the tribe in determining just who gets the government money today. For Seminole leaders like Chief Jerry Haney, this is what it now comes down to. Proof. I've met several Black Seminole women, some of whom look Indian, and yet they can't participate in the benefits. They know they have Indian blood.
I'm well aware of that. The individuals that I know of that say that, you're absolutely right. They show a lot of Indian in them. But it's up to the individual to prove that they are Indians. And this is where the problem is. They can't prove it with the Dawes Commission roll.
What happened to your front porch? You have no steps.
No steps. No steps there, no steps here. And I need a whole house here.
Polly Gentry has lived her entire life on land her grandmother received 100 years ago as a full member of the tribe. All Seminoles, red and black, were given land in Oklahoma. Polly says she could use some of the $56 million judgment fund to repair her house.
My husband decided he's going to put some bricks around it, and he got, where you see the bricks in now, and he had a heart attack.
And it's been like this.
And it's been like this, so he couldn't get nobody to fix it.
Do you have the money to fix it?
No. No, Lord, no.
So did you apply for a benefit?
Yeah, but they wouldn't give it to me.
The Seminoles have $56 million coming from the government, and how much of it did you
you want? I want enough that I can get me a house built where I can live comfortable. Because it ain't no comfort here.
This whole business of degree of Indian blood is just a concoction. It's just an excuse now that's been dreamed up of late in order to exclude the blacks from membership in the tribe. I can tell you this, 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, Seminole Indians would not have been talking about whether or not this black person has Indian blood. It simply wouldn't have mattered. They were Seminoles.
You know what the motion is? Go ahead and vote on it. Mr. Carter.
For more than 100 of those years, Black Seminoles held 4 of the 28 seats on the tribal council. But that ended at a meeting like this one in the summer of 2000, when the Red Seminoles voted the blacks out. Sylvia Davis, who was one of the 4 black council members at the time, says it was humiliating.
It's been hard for me to sit there and listen to the way they talk to the freedmen. It's been very hard for me.
What do they say?
The racist name that they be using toward them, calling them animals' names, cows, stomping feet, roaring at them, telling them to get out.
They don't want you.
That's right, they'll tell you to go back to Africa.
Why do you think the freedmen, the Black Seminoles, belong as part of this tribe?
But we had people that die all over the trail, just like any other people in the nation.
But I guess they're saying, yes, thank you. You fought alongside us in Florida. That was 200 years ago. It's time for us to separate.
I would just let them know that we have all rights within the Seminole Nation.
But Chief Haney says many of the Black Seminoles and even some of the Blood Seminoles weren't interested in being part of the tribe until it included benefits, namely a piece of that $56 million government payout.
The tribe wanted to have an Indian tribe that was all Indian tribe.
There are too many freedmen.
I think there's a lot of freedmen out there now that are eligible to join, but have not joined because there are no benefits.
But you think if there were benefits for them, suddenly freedmen would be coming from
Yes.
all across the country?
Yes.
Let me tell you what it looks like from the outside, though. It looks like the freedmen fought wars, died with you, moved on the Trail of Tears from Florida to Oklahoma with you, and now suddenly there's a big pot of money. Let's exclude them.
That may be true to some extent. Reasons for what has happened.
He also says the Red and Black Seminoles have just grown apart over the years and have little in common today. But that's not how Sylvia Davis sees it. She's hired Will and John Veely, 2 young attorneys who specialize in Indian law. They're suing the government on behalf of the Black Seminoles.
The entire tribe received the county in exchange for a state. When that was individually allotted, all Seminoles, including the Black Seminoles, received their individual lots. When the United States awarded $56 million, shouldn't the same people that received the land before also receive the money? The tribe's the same.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs chose not to speak on camera, citing the pending lawsuit. However, in a letter to us, they say that these kinds of issues are up to the tribe. Eligibility for the judgment fund, the letter says, may depend upon whether a current member is descended from a member of the tribe as the tribe existed in 1823. However, the letter says, deciding who's in and who's out is solely within the purview of the tribe. But the Black Seminoles say they won't go quietly. They continue trying to cast votes and participate in tribal meetings without success. Bud Crockett says he won't be denied his heritage, but he won't beg for it either.
It's not all about the money. It's about setting the history record straight about our ancestry and our history and what legacy we intend to leave for our kids.
Since the Black Seminoles were removed, the government has cut off all federal funding to the tribe. That's persuaded some, like Chief Haney, to say they should be allowed back in. But he still says they're not entitled to that $56 million.
All right, so it's a lot to unpack there as far as that is concerned. But before we unpack that, let's start with the beginning and the history that leads up to that point. All right, so let's first start with the story of the Black Seminoles. It begins with the Maroon communities of the 1500s. Maroons, as it pertains to the New World, is noted by Professor Mary Richard Price as communities that compound of self-liberated enslaved Africans and their descendants who dotted the fringes of plantation America, also from Brazil to Florida, from Peru to Texas. So maroon communities called palincas in Spanish colonies and macumbos or calimbos in Brazil range from tiny bands that survived less than a year to powerful states encompassing thousands of members that lasted for decades or even centuries. Maroons in general were not a new concept in the Western Hemisphere before 1700, being that they came into existence a few decades after Christopher Columbus made landfall in 1492. On July 13, 1571, King Philip II of Spain, via a real cedula, authorized the Audiencia of Santo Domingo to enact plans to conquer a community of African Cimarrones, Maroons, runaway slaves, as I said before, located about 36 miles from the city of Santo Domingo. La Florida. So just as the Spanish colony of Florida became the first colony on North American soil to grant enslaved Africans who escaped bondage their own sanctioned municipality, it also was the site of major Maroon activity in the 1700s. A sizable amount of enslaved Gullahs managed to escape from coastal South Carolina and Georgia into the Florida Peninsula. The Gullahs, so the Gullah Geechee, how many of you ever heard of Gullah Gullah Island, the Nickelodeon show? So the Gullahs were establishing their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness by at least the late 1700s. At least by the late 1700s. They built separate villages of thatch roof houses surrounded by fields of corn and swamp rice, and they maintained friendly relations with the mixed population of Native Americans. In time, the two groups came to view themselves as parts of the same loosely organized tribe in which black people in that society held important positions of leadership. The Genesis. So the Gullah communities in Florida blending with Creek, Miccosukee, and Apalachicola tribes came to be called Black Seminoles because of their shared societies. It is this conglomerate of Native American nations that adopted the name Seminole by 1822. In time, the Black Maroon communities developed into separate settlements, villages, and towns adjacent to the Native American settlements. So this is where we come to the point where we talk about the land that the Seminoles, the Black Seminoles, had in Florida, and still to this day have not been compensated with, as far as the federal government confiscating, and even in some cases, as we will see, burnt down. So the first noted community was Angola. So it was located near present-day Tampa Bay along the Manatee River and closely associated with a large Seminole community in the vicinity. By the advent of the Second Seminole War, which was starting in 1835, there were 5 distinct Black Seminole towns in which the mass of the Black Seminole population lived. They were Pilicahila, King Hadjo's Town, Bucher Women's Town, Mulatto Girls Town, and Minata. And specifically, Pilicahila is very important in this story here because that site still exists to this day near Bushnell area, about an hour west of Mount Dora. And that site is still there today. In fact, they have a monument there. I just went there last week. Very somber area, but it exists.
Is it a park or woods or what?
No, it's just a side of the road with a plaque. And so we'll get more into that a little later. So the Black Seminoles, theft of land. The Black Seminoles would eventually become a point of contention when the United States government decided to remove the Seminole Nation from Florida and move them to Oklahoma. Removing Native Americans from their lands became a top priority of the administration of President who? Andrew Jackson. In Florida, Seminole removal meant the acquisition of land. It always means the acquisition of land, not just in this case the Seminoles or Black Seminoles, but if you look at every other disaster burning down of black lands in Florida. So I'm specifically referencing the Ocoee Massacre. I'm specifically referencing Rosewood Massacre. It's always about the theft of land. And the retrieval of enslaved Africans to continue to be sold and pressed into servitude at the behest of the government. So you still have a contingent of people out there that don't believe the federal government was complicit in the sale and moving of and specifically the sale of enslaved Africans. And so some people say, oh, it was just a state thing or a local thing, not necessarily the federal. Oh no, it was definitely the federal government as well, as we said before. And so. First World Nole War, I call it the Nole War. So starting in the early 1800s, Seminole raids into Georgia and attacks by U.S. settlers on Seminole lands fueled tensions. So General Andrew Jackson led U.S. forces into Florida in 1818 without formal authorization, claiming the need to end Seminole raids and suppress Spanish support. Jackson's forces captured several key locations, including Spanish forts at Pensacola and at St. Mark's, right? And at St. Mark's. So after this Seminole War, the First Seminole War ended, we have to be mindful that, let me continue, that Jackson's troops destroyed Seminole villages, targeting both Native Americans and escaped slaves. So the war weakened Spanish control of Florida, leading to what the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, in which Spain ceded Florida to the United States later in what year? 1821, right? 1821. And by 1822, although the Trail of Tears had not begun yet until 1830, you did have a contingent of black Seminoles who escaped and they went down to the Bahamas. And there's the Bahamas, and there's a great book on this that to this day, the descendants of those black Seminoles who escaped down to the Bahamas, they still have preserved their cultural customs from that period, the early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, and they themselves still consider themselves part of the Seminole tribe, right? So that's a bit of history there. The Second Seminole War illustrated not only the symbiotic relationship that developed between the black Seminoles and the Native American tribe, but also demonstrated the relationship that black Seminoles had with who? Enslaved Africans on nearby plantations. Now, this really spooked the United States government, really spooked them. And so the U.S. government enacted what? The Indian Removal Act by 1830, or in 1830, which sought to relocate Native American tribes, including the Seminoles, to lands west of the Mississippi to free up land for who? White settlers. So U.S. officials pressured Seminole leaders to sign a Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832, agreeing to the relocation. However, many Seminoles led by Chief Osceola and John Horse, who was of African ancestry, John Horse, and we'll talk about him later. And we also talk about Chief Osceola's ancestry because he's been platformed greatly when you talk about Seminoles. That's one of the first things you think about is Chief Osceola. But what many people don't know, well, let me ask you, the audience, do you know who Chief Osceola, what his real name was? Somebody want to look it up for me real quick? A quick Google search. Chief Osceola's real name? Who? Okay, all right, Billy. And what was his ancestry? Because it wasn't many people think he was pure Seminole or Indian or whatnot. But his father was what? Say it again? His father? Complete opposite.
Great-grandfather was a Scotch.
Okay, there we go. And who was? Yes. So say it again.
The plantation owner?
You know what? That's good. Well, he was from Scotland. So, all right. So his lineage, Chief Osceola is of Scottish descent, and his mother was of Creek, right? So many people don't know that. So some people you may say, oh, he had black in him. No, he didn't. Scottish. The Seminole who they're thinking of, who they get mixed up with Chief Osceola is really John Horse, who was of African ancestry. But you don't hear about it. How many of you ever heard of John Horse before I just uttered his name tonight? Exactly. So history, as you all know, is his story. So to continue, however, many Seminoles led by Chief Osceola and John Horse rejected the treaty, claiming it was signed under duress and did not represent their wishes. So the Dade Massacre in 1835 was a pivotal event in which Seminoles ambushed and killed over 100 U.S. soldiers near modern-day Bushnell, Florida, marking the start of the Second Seminole War. Bushnell, Florida, near Bushnell, Florida. So we're talking about near as we said before, Pilicahuila, which also was known as Abrahamstown. It was known as Abrahamstown because there was a formerly enslaved African who escaped and took refuge in Pilicahuila. So they named it, it became known as Abrahamstown, that settlement, that land. And so the U.S. deployed over 30,000 troops over the course of the war. Black Seminoles extended both a welcome and a camaraderie to blacks in the territory. So when we talk about blacks in the territory, we're talking about those who were enslaved on nearby plantations, right? So black Seminoles often would cross the territorial boundaries and establish relationships with those, as I said before, on the nearby plantations. The black Seminoles used the dense Florida swamps and forests to their advantage, engaging in hit-and-run attacks against the U.S. forces. We're talking about, this is the Second Seminole War. So generals like Thomas Jessup and Zachary Taylor, who eventually became president, led efforts to suppress the Seminoles, but faced challenges due to difficult terrain and determined resistance because obviously the black Seminoles, who many were formerly enslaved, did not want to go back into slavery. So they fought very valiantly. And as the war went on, General Thomas Jessup attempted to negotiate an end to the Second Seminole War. But because of the black Seminoles' influence, he changed his mind about the terms. So Jessup wrote, "The Seminoles understood the Negroes living among them. And since before the war, an estimated 4/5 of the Seminole Negroes, including Abraham, were runaway slaves, and during the War of the Seminole had been joined by several hundred more runaways. The Seminoles' allies numbered far more Negroes than the Seminole slaves." So what do we have here? So what's being said here, this is a first-hand account by General Jessup from the United States government, that the runaway slaves numbered into several hundreds, and we're not talking about just from nearby plantations in the state of Florida. We're talking about from all over the Southeast, from Arkansas, Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, all over formerly enslaved Africans, because they're not African Americans yet, right? Still considered 3/5 of a person, and their ancestry is directly from Africa. So these Africans, enslaved Africans who just happened to be on American soil, they saw a refuge in Florida because they heard about what was going on, the resistance. And so on April 8th, 1837, General Jessup entered a clandestine arrangement with Coyhajo, another Black Seminole great, and other chiefs to surrender the Negroes taken during the war. Jessup wrote to General R. Jones, when several Floridians arrived in the immigration camp to search for slaves, so we're talking about white settlers who were slave masters, to search for slaves, the Negroes and many Indians fled. On June 2nd, the young militants, again, Chief Osceola, Philip Sons Wildcat, and John Cavella, who's also known as John Horse, seized and carried away the Seminole hostages given under the terms of the truce. And then this is what General Jessup says: all is lost, and principally by the influence of the Negroes. So basically, they lost the war. They lost the war. The American government lost the war. They were getting ready to retreat. And he specifically said this was due, this General Thomas Jessup said this was due to the fighting that and the resistance and the cunning and the tactics used by the Black Seminoles. You know, and this is something that, you know, we don't hear this in our education system here in Florida, as far as the impact of what happened. And so the fierce resistance by the Black Seminoles and escaped slaves in the Second Seminole War deeply disturbed Jessup, prompting him to plan for a retreat. So he says the two Indians are rapidly approximating. They are identified in interest and feelings. Plantation slaves had been prominent in depredations, and one had occupied a ship. So he was surprised that a enslaved African, formerly enslaved because he's freed himself, occupied and operated a ship. You know, that was, you know, and in those days it was thought, it's just kind of like, you know, in modern times, you know, maybe in the 70s and 80s, you know, it wasn't possible for there to be a black quarterback. You know, that's not possible. And so the same feeling applied to the, you know, somebody operating a ship. You had to be seen as very intelligent to operate and commandeer a ship. So for him to see somebody black and who he thought was formerly enslaved to operate a ship, that was something to this General Jessup. And so should the Indians, he says, we're talking about the Red Indians, quote unquote, remain in this territory, the Negroes among them will form a rallying point for runaway Negroes from the adjacent states. So it's just like I told you. He was very concerned and deeply disturbed because of the fighting that the Black Seminoles did. He was concerned that this Florida would be the rallying point, really, and he says, and if they remove, the fastness of the country will be immediately occupied by Negroes. So basically, he was afraid that there was going to be a state takeover of black, formerly enslaved, and now freedmen Seminoles. That's what he was afraid of. That's what the government was afraid of. So regarding the tenacity and leadership of the Black Seminoles, General Jessup wrote, this is what he said. He said, this, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war. The general sentiment of the Black Seminoles of white American leaders was that the enslaved who had escaped bondage to fight with the Seminoles were contending against the entire military power of the United States. So when the Army finally captured the Black Seminoles, officers refused to return them to their master, fearing that these seasoned warriors, accustomed to their freedom, would wreak havoc on the southern plantations and cause a revolution like the Black Haitians revolting against the French, which that happened in 1792, right? Starting in the 1780s. And then, if you know the story, how many of you know the story of how Haiti freed itself in the late 1700s, right? And because of that, the America doubled in size, if you know the history. Because what happened? Because once the formerly enslaved or the enslaved on Haiti defeated Napoleon Bonaparte, what did Napoleon Bonaparte do? He sold the Louisiana Territory, right, to the United States government for how much? $15 million, which in those days was a lot of money. But still, he sold the Louisiana Territory. And we're not talking about, when we talk about Louisiana Territory, we're not talking about what the state of Louisiana is today. We're talking about the entire Midwest was the Louisiana Territory. So with that in mind, so understand these generals understood history. They understood what was at stake when facing these Black Seminoles, right? They understood what was at stake here. So the end of No War II. So the United States spent more than $20 million, which at the time, and still to this day, is the largest amount of money the United States government has ever spent on a war on its soil, right? So fighting the Seminoles during this period, the war left more than 1,500 soldiers and uncounted American civilians dead. Now let's go back to Pilicalia. So again, as we said before, it was established and led by Abraham. Well, it wasn't established by Abraham because it was actually established in 1813. So it was established before the cutoff point where the United States government said that how the lands were as they were in 1823, right? So this territory that the Black Seminoles were on was actually established in 1813, so 10 years before 1823. So that's one point there. And then Abraham came in 1826, right? And so he became very influential and was an interpreter and counselor to Seminole Chief Micanopy. So this particular settlement was under the care of Chief Micanopy. And so, as you know, Micanopy is not too far from Bushnell. So Pilicalia is a Miccosukee word meaning many ponds. And so at its peak, it was the largest and most prosperous Black Seminole town in Florida with a population of about 100 residents. And it featured timber and thatched daub homes, cattle herds, and fields of rice and peanuts. So the town was burned down to the ground on March 30th, 1836 by who? By U.S. Army soldiers under General Abraham Eustis. How many of you ever heard of the town Eustis? Right by Mount Dora, right? So, and that town Eustis was named after Abraham Eustis. And so this was as we said before, during the Second Seminole War. So again, once they burned down that settlement, white settlers moved in. And so till to this day. And so in 1837, Osceola was captured by, so actually let's go back to that. So again, making that point that specifically that settlement, over 100 residents in that settlement, it still stands to this day. You could go by there to this day. You could put it in Google and it come up on Google Maps and you could go drive to it right now. And so that is the proof that Black Seminoles own land here in Florida. and we're never compensated as part of that $56 million judgment for whether it was that town or the other 4 settlements that they were on.
Where was that town again?
Okay, so it's not too far from Bushnell. It's in the city called Center Hill. And and like I said, I just went by there last week because I was lecturing in Mount Dora. And so it's about 45 minutes from Mount Dora. So I said, okay, let me just go ahead and take a drive over there. And again, very serene, very somber, and very interesting. And so if you ever do a trip as far as along the trail of old historic Florida, definitely include that on your trip.
It's not the site of the old Day battlefield.
It's near there. It's near there. It is near there because actually when you're coming in there, it has along that area you can see the signs that says that. So, in 1837, so that was in 1836 that was burned down. So then in 1837, Osceola was captured by orders of General Jessup under a flag of truce during the negotiations near St. Augustine, Florida. A move considered dishonorable even by some U.S. officials. So to explain this, General Jessup, he threw a Hail Mary, to go back to football reference. He said, okay, we're going to give up. So all of the Seminole leaders came so they could negotiate the terms of the United States government getting out. And what happened? They were captured. And he was imprisoned at Fort Marion, Castillo de San Marcos, and later transferred to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, where he died of malaria in 1838, January 30th, 1838. That's when Chief Osceola died. But guess what? The war didn't officially end until when? 1842. So again, that's why I said before, the elevation, granted, he was a great chief, but you have to look at the hows and the whys. And so by 1842, the war largely ended, as I said before, although sporadic fighting and resistance continued in the years that followed. All right, so no War III. So the Seminole War, the Third Seminole War was between 1855 to 1858 and was the final conflict between the United States and the Seminole people in Florida. It was the culmination of decades of tension over the U.S. efforts to remove the Seminoles from Florida and relocate them to modern-day Oklahoma. So after the Second Seminole War, as we said before, ended in 1842, only a small group of Seminoles remained in the Florida Everglades, living in isolation. So these are the Miccosukee, these are the Miami people, and some other tribes. So again, when explaining this, we have to remember that there's two tribes of Seminole, right? There's the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. So those people obviously originated, or their lineage is in Florida, but they moved to Oklahoma because of what? The Trail of Tears. And the ones that stay behind is the Seminole tribe of Florida, that's the Seminole tribe. That's the tribe that owns what? Hard Rock. So we'll go into that later. But exactly. So the war was triggered in 1855 when a U.S. Army Patrol Lieutenant George Hartsuff deliberately destroyed a Seminole garden. Again, destroying is always about destroying, provoking retaliation. Seminoles led by Chief Billy Bowlegs attacked the soldiers, killing and wounding several. In 1858, Chief Billy Bowlegs and about 160 Seminoles accepted the U.S. government offer and money to relocate to Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma. The Seminoles who stayed in Florida became the ancestors of the modern-day Seminole tribe of Florida, which is recognized as a sovereign nation today. And so, now let's talk about John Horse. The significance of the Black Seminoles is that their alliance with the Seminole Native American tribe, as well as with the enslaved runaways from the plantations to create their own nation, exemplifies Martin Delaney's conception of Black nationalism. So had the Black Seminoles not established alliances and networks throughout Florida and the Southern Atlantic, they would have not been positioned to sustain the costly rebellion against the American government. The person most prominent in leading the Black Seminole Rebellion and later free Black settlements was Juan Cabala, also known as John Horace Juan Cabala and or Gopher John. Gopher John. So why was he known as Gopher John? He was born a slave of African and American, Indian, and Spanish descent at the time of the War of 1812. His mother was an African woman, pure African, who was a slave to his father, who was a Seminole Indian slave trader. And so his father had different mixes of Native American in him. So his father's name was Charlie Cavallo. And so John Horace and his mother were the property of Cavallo, but lived in one of the Oconee Seminole settlements populated by Black people along the Swanee River, as we said before, near the Tampa Bay. As a child, John Horace was known as Juan, and he earned the name Gopher John after it was discovered that he was swindling his personal cook. And he would sell him the same tortoise, pretending it was different tortoises, in exchange for the cook's meals. The particular tortoise he was using was the gopher, right? The gopher tortoise. In his lifetime, he fought as a sub-chief during the Second Seminole War, served as a decorated officer in the Mexican military, and met 2 presidents of the United States, including James Polk in 1844. So he was an advisor working as an interpreter for the Seminole chiefs. He was an advisor to Osceola and Chief Wildcat. So during the Second Seminole War, he fought against the U.S. troops. General Thomas Jessup had agreed, as we said before, Grant had agreed to grant freedom to fugitive slaves who accepted relocation, but white planters and slavers arrived at Fort Brooks, Florida, prepared to return the Black Indians to slavery. Under a starless night, the legend goes that John Horace and his warriors led 700 Seminoles and Black Seminoles Indians from the relocation camps. Again, John Horace and the chiefs tried peace talks, this time under a white flag truce, as we said before. But the men were seized, imprisoned at Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, fasting until he was able to slide through the bars. He escaped, taking 16 others with him. And so he returned to the Seminoles and fought in the Battle of Okeechobee, the last conflict of the Second Seminole War. In 1830, the major conflict. So in 1838, John surrendered to U.S. troops. So with the Seminoles and Black Seminole Indians, he was shipped from Tampa Bay to New Orleans and then to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. So the arrival in Indian Territory was more dangerous than living in Florida. This was Creek Indian Territory. So who was the Creeks? The Creeks had settled on the land the Army had promised to the Seminoles, but the Creeks were notorious for capturing, selling, and enslaving blacks. So during John's next trip to Washington, D.C., he lobbied for but was unable to secure a treaty to receive separate land for his people. However, he was granted property at Fort Gibson. While he was in Washington, then Attorney General John Mason ruled that the Black Seminoles were functionally fair game for who? Slave raiders. So John returned to find his sister's children had been captured by who? The Creeks, and sold, right? So the Creeks considered one of the 5 civilized tribes. So John Horace, with approximately 289 supporters, established their own communities in the Weewaka Creek bottomlands in Seminole and its branches in the Western Creek Nation in 1849 in Oklahoma, not modern-day Oklahoma. There they cleared land, built homes, and cultivated crops. The modern city of Weewaka, Oklahoma is located south of one of the original settlements. Horse became the de facto leader of the Weewaka Creek group and kept a well-armed, independent, and free from slaving activities. Deeply concerned for his people's well-being in Indian territory, Horse reluctantly left the West. He left. And so in the autumn of 1849, accompanied by Seminole Chief Wildcat and around 100 followers, he departed the Weewaka Creek settlement to establish their long-held dream of a new nation where? In Mexico. In Mexico. And so on July 12, 1850, they presented themselves at Piedra Negras and were giving land in Mexico for settlement. He fought in the Mexican army, riding his horse American, and was given the rank of colonel. So many of the immigrants also served as border guards for the Mexican government. When the Civil War ended, John returned to the United States along with many of the black Indians and settled near Fort Duncan, Texas, where he remained until the summer of 1876. His final days in Texas were spent negotiating for promised land for the black Indians. In 1882, as a 70-year-old, one of his last fights came when the land the Mexican government promised to the Seminoles were being threatened by greedy landowners. John Horse rode into Mexico City to secure written agreements giving the land to the Seminoles. Unfortunately, he died during his final mission. So after the Second Seminole War, approximately 4,000 Seminoles were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory as part of the Trail of Tears. The journey west was arduous, marked by disease, starvation, and harsh conditions. And so once in Oklahoma, the relocated Seminoles struggled to adapt to their new environment, which differed greatly, obviously, from Florida, snow, very cold. They faced conflicts with other tribes already settled in the area, as we said before, particularly the Creeks, over land and resources. Hard rock. So the Seminoles who stayed in Florida endured extreme poverty and isolation, but preserved their cultural identity and sovereignty. They are the ancestors of the modern day Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe. So they are the, in this time period. So after 1858, after the Third Seminole War, they settled along where? Alligator Alley, right? Alligator Alley. And so what they would do was, to get money, was that they would, perform different things, things such as wrestling alligators and certain other types of shows for people who were traveling along Alligator Alley. And they also had, once we got to about the 1950s and 60s, they started having bingo halls. And then from the bingo halls came what? Purchasing of the casino. Exactly. They purchased it. All right, so the Dawes Act. So the Seminoles who stayed in Florida endured extreme poverty, as we said before. So no, this is hard rock. The Dawes Act. This was enacted in 1887. Aimed to assimilate Native Americans by dividing tribal lands into individual allotments, as we said before. So the remaining lands were sold to non-native settlers. So let's unpack this for a second. As was said in the video, the black Seminoles received individual allotments of land in Oklahoma. They received allotments of land. But as we said before, once the 1990 $56 million judgment came, they did not receive the money. So they received the land as compensation for the lands that they were on, one of whom was Abrahamstown and the 4 other lands, but they did not receive the money. So you see, so that's where the conflict is even still to this very day. So, and then the part of remaining lands were sold to non-native settlers. How many of you ever heard of the term $5 Indian? The $5 Indian. that term is given to white people who bribed the federal government to get on the Dawes rolls with $5. And so when you think about the ownership of some of these casinos, one may ask the question, are some of these owners, are they of red Seminole, quote unquote, lineage? So that's one of those things, that's something that you can do further research into, but just wanted to make note of that, the $5 Indian. And so as we said before, to receive an allotment, individuals had to be enrolled on the Dawes rolls, which categorized members of 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. So those are considered the 5 civilized tribes, 5 civilized tribes, which in itself is kind of ridiculous, civilized, right? But in good old American government fashion, that's what it is. So the Dawes rolls, officially known as the final rolls of citizens and freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, were a set of documents created between 1898 and 1907 to determine eligibility for land allotments, as we said before. So now you may be confused and say, okay, well, if the Black Seminoles are recognized on these rolls, what's the issue? Yes, they're recognized as freedmen, but not as citizens of the tribe or of the nation. They're recognized as freedmen. And so from the United States government perspective is that we did our job as far as the land allotment and the 56 million. Now it's incumbent upon your nation and or your tribe to determine your eligibility. So then the tribe is like, well, you're not eligible because according to the Dawes rolls, you're not a member or you're not a citizen, you see? So,
They weren't citizens. The Black Seminoles were not citizens.
well, again, we're talking about the money was not about citizens, it was about the compensation of land from before 1823. And as I said before, these lands, specifically Abrahamstown, was established before 1823 and was burnt down in 1836. So they were never compensated to this day for that land that was confiscated and or burned down. But they were compensated with land allotments, but not with the money. So that's the issue. So for the Black Seminoles, also known as Seminole freedmen, these roles played a critical role in defining their legal and tribal status within the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Reorganization. So when the tribe reorganized under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1830, some Seminoles wanted to, so even then in 1934, I'm sorry. So not just in 2000 when they did kick them off, right, at least temporarily until the U.S. government was like, well, we ain't giving you no money if you kick them off, right? But even going back to 1934, some Seminoles, quote unquote red Seminoles, wanted to exclude the freedmen. When we say freedmen, we're talking about the Black Seminoles, right? And keep the tribe as Native American only, as you heard Chief Haney say. It was not until the 1950s that the Black Seminoles were even officially recognized in the Seminole Constitution, right? They were not officially recognized. And so today, the Black descendants live in rural communities around the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. So there are 14 bands in the Seminole Nation. And 2 of those bands are of Black Seminoles. So the Caesar Bruner Band, they are the Caesar Bruner Band and the Dozier Barkis Band. How many of you heard of that before tonight? Before me just uttering that? Very important stuff here. Very important stuff. And as an aside, I did my undergraduate at Florida State University. So I used to walk by that statue of Chief Osceola and, unconquered, you know. And this history was never, ever, ever mentioned in any of my classes, in any type of official documents from the university, nothing. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Very important stuff. So who was Caesar? Let's talk about Caesar Brunner. Again, so two Black Seminole bands, Caesar Brunner Band and the Dozier Barkis Band. Caesar Brunner Band was named after Caesar Brunner, a freedman who was born in Florida around 1813. He arrived in Indian Territory over the historical Trail of Tears, so Indian Territory in Seminole, in Seminole County, Oklahoma. Under his leadership, a small freedmen community called Brunertown was formed. It was not, as we said before, okay, so Caesar Brunner, as I was saying with Caesar Brunner. Under his leadership, a small freedmen community called Brunertown was formed. Several members of the extended Brunner family settled around him. The settlement was located midway between present towns of Seminole and Kanawha on Salt Creek. Caesar Brunner was the son-in-law to who? Abraham. Abraham. So the Caesar Brunner Band is today is directly aligned from Abraham. So again, so when we talk about the compensation of the 56 million of the descendants, specifically, we're talking about specifically when it comes to litigation from the Caesar Brunner Band. All right. And so sometime in 1870, Caesar Brunner found a new location for his people in Turkey Creek, where there was plenty of room for fishing, hunting, and cattle ranching. Now let's talk about the Dozier Barkis, which traces its origins to William Noble, who led the group from 1870 to 1898. So after his leadership, Dozier Barkis took over, and the band was officially named after him. The Dawes Rolls recognized this group as the Dozier Barkis Band, comprising individuals who had been enslaved by John Jumper, a chief of the Seminole Nation. And then, so you have some minor bands, as we said before, out in Mexico and Texas. And this specifically is the John Horse Band, in which back in 2024 was recognized by Representative Eddie Morales. So this is the chief of the John Horse Band, and they trace their lineage directly from John Horse, specifically when they were on the settlement of John Horse when they were along the border. Then you have the Negro Muskogos. In 1850, as we said before, led by John Horse and the Seminole Wildcat, they crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico, and then they established this community in the Nacimiento de los Negros near the town of Mesquite in the state of Coahuila. They celebrate annual events like Juneteenth still to this day, commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. The Negros Muskogos are recognized as one of Mexico's Afro-Mexican communities, and their contributions to Mexican history and culture are increasingly acknowledged. Disenfranchised. So in 1866, in a treaty between the Seminole Nation and the United States government, and this is what was said by Sylvia Davis in the mini documentary that we wrote and that we watched, it said that Seminole freedmen were promised all the rights of Native citizens. All the rights. So again, so this is why the federal government, when they did the land allotments, gave the Black Seminoles land allotments. But when it came to the money, they left it up to the Seminole tribe. So again, this is also part of that litigation. So as we said before, however, the living ancestors of Seminole freedmen and Black Seminole natives continue to report experience of systemic racism within the Seminole Nation that they claim directly contradict this treaty's agreement. Because many Seminole freedmen are not recognized as full citizens of their respective Seminole tribe, but rather as members, They don't have access to crucial tribal services such as that $56 million judgment, or health care, or life insurance, or burial assistance, or even at the time, doses of COVID-19 vaccine that were relegated to the Native American tribes. Although later, I think once this became a thing, I believe that they were allowed some of that COVID-19 vaccine. But as we said before, what about the rest of the benefits? And so the Seminole freedmen, reparations denied. The Seminole freedmen have worked to gain a share of the $56 million judgment trust the United States paid the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma in 1990, Seminole Nation of Oklahoma in 1990 for the seizure of lands in Florida in 1823. So in 1999, the Seminole freedmen's suit against the government was dismissed in the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th District or 10th Circuit. The court ruled the freedmen could not bring suit independently of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, which refused to join the claim on the issue. So in 2000, the Seminole Nation voted to exclude the freedmen descendants from tribal membership unless they could prove Seminole blood ancestry via what? The Dawes rolls. Not by Ancestry.com or by, or DNA testing or what have you, but by the Dawes rolls, which from its inception was flawed, right? So despite the promises of the 1866 treaty. So the excluded freedmen argued that the Dawes rolls were inaccurate and often classified persons with both Seminole and African ancestry as only freedmen and not as citizens, right? and not as or as Seminole. So the District Court of the District of Columbia ruled in September 2002 in Seminole Nation of Oklahoma versus Norton that freedmen retained membership and voting rights. However, the tribe maintained a separate status for the black freedmen and does not consider them, as I said, full members or members by blood. So that's where you heard Chief Haney say they're not blood Seminoles. They're not blood Seminoles, right? They're not blood Seminoles. Even though, as you could clearly see from these descendants, they're blood Seminoles. You can see their facial features. It's a mix between quote unquote red Seminole and African. And so with that being said, thank you so much. Again, this is not Florida Humanities Talk, but thanks. And here is my book. The QR codes are for expired or something, I don't know. But anyway, this is my book and I have copies here available for sale. So thank you.